all see my screen, and we will get going at this point. So, yeah, I'm here to talk about leadership, specifically a leadership theory called adaptive leadership. I should probably share a few thoughts about myself or a little bit about myself because maybe that'll be contextual for people who don't know me, a little bit about my background. So I've been in and around technology for for practically all of my life. I remember in the third grade working on green screen. So it's been a minute. But formally, I actually have a undergrad in religion, and I focused on that's a completely different story. But I studied religion, and I did a double minor in computer science and biology. Then decided to go down the computer science path and went back to school and got a graduate degree in software engineering, and then really got very passionate about leadership and management and things like that as I experienced the workplace and the challenges I ran into, and wondering why things were the way they were. And so I went back to school and got another graduate degree, a terminal degree at this point, in leadership and organizational studies. So in a nutshell, that's sort of my background. And throughout this entire time, I've worked in industry, so I kind of describe myself as a pracademic. I'm very much a practitioner, but very much informed by research and what goes on in the academic world. I also happen to be a child of two people. I grew up on a university campus as well, so that probably has something to do with it. And so leadership is one of the things I'm passionate about. And we all talk about it all the time. It's one of the probably most talked about things out there. It's a triple digit $1 billion industry in general. So people pay a lot of attention to it. And people come up with different theories on how to lead, of which adaptive leadership is one. It's one that caught my eye because it was unique in the way it talked about leadership, and probably was a great precursor to some of the work we're seeing in the complexity world. So I think it's a good thing to talk about. And when we think about integrative leadership, which is sort of the theme for this particular conference, uh, bringing people together to solve big problems, whatever they might be, is important. So adaptive leadership is what we'll be talking about here as we go along, and hopefully you find this useful. So let's kick off by Drucker says that only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. And he argued that everything else requires leadership. Now, I'm not going to argue with Drucker today. I've always wondered what he meant by naturally. He's a giant, and so I won't argue with him. But I think the word naturally is a very interesting word. And I think what he's trying to poke at is, without some intentionality, what you will probably see naturally is those three things: friction, confusion, underperformance. And my response to him is that even with leadership, we still see friction, confusion, and underperformance in our orgs. So maybe the reality is that leadership is one of the things that helps us manage or keep that kind of friction, confusion, and underperformance in check. But what's interesting about Drucker's quote here, and many quotes from many of the giants who've gone before us in the leadership and management space, is they often tend to frame leadership as something that somebody does, or an individual does. And while I can see the wisdom in thinking about it that way, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think about leadership through that lens. And it is the common lens. It's the dominant mode of thinking, to think about leadership as what people, as what a sort of set of people in your organization do. It's one of the reasons why in our organizations we talk about a class of people as leadership. I don't know if you've experienced this before, but when things don't go well or they're not working fine, we tend to say those people over there, leadership is not doing what they're supposed to do. So there's leadership, a set of people, and everybody else. And it's the reason why I offer that leadership is really a system response to changes inside and outside of the organization. It's a set of responses to changes inside and outside the organization. And that really means, at the end of the day, that leadership is produced by the system. It's not necessarily something that a single person does, it's something that everybody does together. And while there might be people who have greater influence on the system, so to speak, everybody in some way, some form, or some fashion is contributing to the production of leadership from the system. And when the system cannot produce the leadership to handle changes internally or externally, the system ultimately dies. So when the system cannot cope with either changes going on inside or changes going on the outside, the system eventually collapses in of itself. So whether that's market changes happening, the system cannot respond, or people completely dissatisfied with the way the company is running, and then start a revolt, and then the company folds in on itself. It's all the same thing. It's how are we responding to what's going on in the inside and the outside. So, with that said, you know, I make the argument, a personal argument here, that the system response must have two basic characteristics. Now, not everybody agrees with these characteristics I'm about to share. This is why I am saying it. There are others who also would agree with me in some form or fashion that the system should have these responses, but these are my personal response, my personal opinion based on kind of the way I think about leadership. And the first one is your leadership system must be able to address the challenges in front of it, both effectively and efficiently. And it's become quite cliche for people to offer that efficiency doesn't matter. And I understand where some of that sentiment is coming from. Coming out of the industrial era, and everybody talks about Taylorism and talks about scientific management in all of its negativity, while forgetting that if we didn't have scientific management, a lot of the challenges of the 20th century would have been difficult to overcome, quite honestly. That's just a fact that we've all come to appreciate after the fact. And so people say, we efficiency doesn't matter, but it does matter. Like, when you have a problem with your system and you call somebody, you want them to get back to you in a timely fashion. You don't just want to sit down waiting for somebody to call. You want a response as soon as possible. You want the right response, you want an effective response, but you also want an efficient response. You want to row in the right direction at the right speed, because you can get to your destination, but if you don't get to your destination on time, then it really doesn't make a difference. So it is important that our responses are not only effective, and I think we've begun to over index on this, on the effectiveness side of things, that we forget that a key component of response is being efficient. If we don't have timely action, as it's said from an action inquiry perspective, we run the risk of not achieving the results that we want. If you don't respond when the market, for example, is presenting an opportunity and you don't respond quickly, somebody else will take advantage of that situation. So we need to think about efficiency. We need to think about effectiveness. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along, because these things sometimes are in tension with one another. There's no doubt about it, but we can't discard one for the other. And I just think a lot of the circles I walk in, because efficiency has become a hammer that is, a hit on people. We got to do things faster, more, and all of that. We often have come to think that efficiency is not as important anymore. It's still important. We just need to make sure that it retains its proper place. But the second part is the moral part of the system response. Um, Your system needs to also enable human flourishing through moral and ethical means. There's some who would argue that only good leaders are leaders. I'm not one of those to make that argument. I do believe that systems can achieve their goals through different ways. And this is why we talk about equifinality. We talk about the fact that there are multiple ways to get to a same goal. And this is what makes complex systems actually special. They don't need to take the exact same path to arrive at a shared destination. We can go through different paths. And so, this is why when you study orgs, you find out that successful organizations actually set up and operate very differently. And what I mean by successful in this particular case is successful organizations measured financially, which is kind of the primary measure of success in our world today. We may not like it. We may be disappointed with it. We might wish the world was different from what it is. But I'm one of those people that likes to say, we first have to accept the world for what it is before we can actually change it to be what we'd want it to be. So, what it is today is that financial metrics, in most cases, determine or are used to determine how successful a company is. And so, when you look through companies and you walk through them and interview and talk to them, like I have done, you find that they have a whole sort of different ways or cultures, as some might put it, but they have different operating models that support or have enabled them to become successful, financially successful. But where another place where there's often significant difference is how people feel in that company. How people feel in that company. I don't know about you, but I've worked in companies where we did financially okay, but I necessarily wasn't a happy employee. And there are many people who find themselves in that situation. In fact, almost every measure of employee engagement is relatively low. So, however you want to interpret those measures, they're generally low. So, this is why I assert that the response must enable human flourishing through moral and ethical means. So it's not just enough to achieve the end, whatever the end might be. We must also ask ourselves, how are we achieving the end? And the means that we're using, what are they doing? And we must look at the people in the org, the people we're working with, the people that we rub shoulders with every day. We must see them as ends in of themselves as well. We must see ourselves and see them as people that need to flourish, need to thrive, and need to grow, need to develop. And so, whatever I'm doing, I need to ask myself in any capacity, am I part of a system that, yes, is achieving the higher order outcomes, if you will, or the outcomes with financial measures associated with them, but also are we achieving the human flourishing that is desired? And so this is what I assert. I'm not alone in asserting this, but we must be honest with ourselves and accept that there are others who don't assert this kind of view. There are others who assert the view that all that matters is making sure that the company is successful. It's the difference between seeing profit as fuel for your organization to do good things in the world versus seeing profit as the thing that you exist for. Or a better example is, do you see meat? I think it's Aristotle who might have said this, or one of the great Greeks suggested. Do you see meat as, do you see killing animals for meat to be the reason why you exist? Because we all need to eat. But do you see killing animals for meat to be your reason for existence, profit? Or do you see killing animals for meat to eat to be the fuel that allows you to go and do good in the world, right? So these are kind of two basic worldviews that you can see out there around business. You might argue that capitalism definitely places a lot of pressure or encourages the first view, which is, hey, profit is all that matters and everything else is secondary. But when I think about a leadership system, I'm always asking myself, are we solving the problems we need to solve? And are the people in the system growing and developing as part of that system? And so when we are solving the problems that we need to solve and people are growing, we have what we would describe here as the maximum adaptive response. That's what you have. And so this is a response where you basically look at the world outside of you, you learn from it, and then you make the appropriate changes to deal with the challenges that face you, and you end up with a maximum adaptive response. And so everyone should always be angling towards how do we make sure we have a maximum adaptive response. And let me just explain this based on the work of Piaget. Assimilation is, you have two dimensions here: assimilation and accommodation. And assimilation is really about receiving and learning new information, like adding to the set of information you have. While accommodation says, hey, I am going to change the way I operate based on this new information I have received. Right. A great example is, I'm reminded all the time about how sugar is not great for me. High assimilation. But I must be honest with you, like my accommodation for that has been extremely low. So I live in that natural selection bucket. So I'm just hopefully I continue to survive here. But that's the point, trying to make that it's that balance of assimilation and accommodation that are extremely important when we think about the responses we're making to the challenges in front of us. Natural selection basically says, hey, we're just, for all intents and purposes, we are getting lucky. We're learning a lot of things, we're not making any changes, and maybe we got lucky because the environment around us changed. And that's all. An example I like to use here is like, it is a difference between playing racquetball and tennis, at least professionally. If you play tennis professionally and you're a top 10 player, you're going to make a lot of money regardless of whether you win tournaments or not. So people can give you all the feedback in the world and you can accept all the feedback in the world. But if you don't make any changes, low accommodation, simply because you're good enough, you're going to continue to make money. Natural selection. So sometimes we get lucky in our systems because we are just well placed and well situated. Uh, Low accommodation and low assimilation, the cultural trap is we've always done it this way and it's worked for us. And so we're not going to change anything. I think that's something that probably most of us can relate to, especially if you've been part of trying to lead a change in an org and people say, no, 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 no. We've been doing this thing this way for so many years. Can't you see how successful we are? There is no need to change anything. This has been our process. This is how we've developed solutions. This is how we've organized teams. Look at all the success we've had. No need to make any changes. And so that we're stuck in a cultural trap. What got us here, we believe strongly, is going to continue to lead us to succeed in the future. And so we have low accommodation and low assimilation. We don't learn, we don't change, we make no changes. I'm sure that resonates with many of us on this call. At least we've probably diagnosed our environments to be in that way. And then serendipity, just here, is another situation where we in some ways just muddle through is kind of the way I like to think about it. We just muddle through. An example I like to think about here is when the Spotify model, and I just put that in quotes, when the Spotify model was very popular and everybody was deciding to implement the Spotify model wherever they were, without really understanding the model. That probably is a great explanation for a lot of what happens in technology, by the way. We introduce and pick up new things without actually taking the time to fully understand them and learn them. And so accommodation is high. We can continue to change and go through a whole bunch of change cycles. But because we don't learn what we need to learn, we end up in these situations where we might be lucky that things work out for us. So it has nothing again to do with us. It just has everything to do with the surroundings that we are in. So the maximum adaptive response is what we're trying to shoot for every single time. And this response is a response that, again, achieves the goals of the system efficiently and effectively, and also supports, encourages, fosters a level of human flourishing, thriving, growth, whatever the case may be in this situation. So I think I, so what happens when we have situations in our organizations that require change? What happens when we have situations that require an adaptive response? Well, the popular response that we see is a select group of people, leadership, they diagnose the problem, they go on an offsite, they go somewhere, they meet, they figure out all the problems, they develop a response, and then they come back and say, all right, this is what everyone's going to do to figure out the response, to address the problem, and here's the response. This is kind of the popular approach. The unpopular approach, which we're going to spend some time talking about here, is really engaging everyone in the org. And I want to be clear here. When I say organization here, I'm using the word in the most liberal way possible, meaning that a software development team is an organization. A department within an org is an organization. So I'm not, when I use organization, I'm just talking about, you can actually put unit at the end of organization to say any collection of people, any group of people that has a mission that they're trying to accomplish, that is trying to solve something from an organizational theory perspective, is an organization. So I'm not just talking about the big company that I belong to, but I am talking to the team that you might be a part of, or the team of teams that you might be a part of, regardless of your organizational situation. Whatever group you belong to is the org that I'm thinking here. So it could be the org in its entirety, can also be the org in this situation, uh, for the team that you belong to. So in this situation, it is having the people facing the challenge, responding to the challenge. And this is the unpopular approach that exists today. So cue in adaptive leadership. And this is what adaptive leadership is really about as we kind of get through the end here. Adaptive leadership says, look, we have a bunch of challenges that we face every day in the organization. And adaptive leadership was developed by Ronald Heifetz, Martin Linsky, and Alexander Grashow. It says we have a bunch of challenges we face in our organization every day. We have technical, adaptive, and technical and adaptive challenges. And their problem definitions and solution determines where the bulk of the work should lie. So when the problem is clear and the solution is clear, the leader of the group does the work. When the problem itself is not clear and will require adaptation, and the solution requires adaptation, then it says the locus of the work lives with the group more than any single individual. And when we have situations where the problem is clear, and the solution will require adaptation, then both the leader and the group will need to get involved. And many organizational challenges have technical and adaptive components to them. For an example, just a simple one, why are we losing a bunch of customers? That's a clear problem. People are dropping off. But what's the solution? Well, not so sure. That will require adaptation. So it's not one person going off and saying, here's a solution. We need to come back and work on what it is. Why are we having so many production incidents? Again, a clear problem definition, but the solution may not be obvious at face value. And one of the big mistakes we make in our teams, in our groups, is to misdiagnose and treat every challenge that we face as technical. In fact, leaders think that leaders make everything technical because they believe they're paid and put in the position to address every single thing as a technical challenge. And so we often make the mistake of treating things as only technical challenge when they have adaptive components to them, or they are fully adaptive. So how do I know if I have an adaptive challenge in front of me? Four basic archetypes that you can use to think about this. And this is maybe some seeds for the open spaces. Gap between espoused values and behavior, competing commitments, speaking the unspeakable, work avoidance. The first one's probably self-evident. we say one thing about our values, but our behavior does not match. When we observe that, we probably have an adaptive challenge. Competing commitments. I'll use an example from the healthcare industry where, healthcare professionals may have a desire to heal, but also they're rated based on customer satisfaction. So sometimes somebody might decide, am I more interested in healing here and providing the right care, or am I more interested in getting a great customer score by doing what this patient wants from me? Speaking the unspeakable, what are the elephants in the room that nobody ever talks about? What are the big problems that no one talks about? And then work avoidance, which is, there's something we need to address. We've committed to addressing it, but no one's really addressing it. Everyone's dancing around it. The people who are asked to work on it don't work on it. They go do something else. So when you kind of look at situations in front of you, you can say to yourself, hey, we have an adaptive challenge here. How do we go about working on it? And remember, an adaptive challenge is a challenge that requires everybody to engage in, to address. So how can you and I encourage adaptive leadership in our organizations, in our groups, in our teams? So I'm going to give three things that you can think about as we go forward. And we've talked about, the first one is the way we think about the challenges and the situations in front of us, the way we go about diagnosing them. Yeah, and our default, especially if you have an engineering kind of background, our default is to kind of look at things and say they're problems. The clock isn't telling the time. It's a technical problem. Let me, go to the back of it and change the battery, and I'll get it to work immediately. But in these situations, you want to be sure that you're paying attention to what exactly is the issue here, and how do I have an adaptive challenge in front of me? Does it does the situation in front of me exhibit any of the attributes that we looked at before from an archetype perspective? Do we have a situation where people are saying one thing? People are saying that, delivering on high quality delivery is important, but at the same time, we're getting pressure to deliver like yesterday. Then you look at yourself and you say, well, we've got competing commitments here. What's going on? And so diagnosing the situations as adaptive situations or adaptive challenges is a key part of what you can do to help foster adaptive leadership in your org or your team or your group. It's taking a step back and saying, hey, this isn't just a simple or technical problem. This is an adaptive situation, and we need to truly understand it and then work together to figure out what the source of this problem is and how we're going to go about addressing it. What else can we do in support of adaptive situations? The other thing we can do is introduce system catalysts, right? And this here is iron that speeds up ammonia. And I think this is an important one to think about, to develop the skills that can create catalysts in your group or your team or your organization. How do you create catalyzing situations? How do you spur people to action with when adaptive challenges? Because remember, with adaptive challenges, you're not the only one who can address it. If it was a technical challenge, you could probably solve it on your own. But because it's an adaptive challenge, you need other people to help you out with the adaptive challenge. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways you can do that is put in conditions that encourage self-organization, right? How do you encourage self-organization within the team? Yeah, think about using things like liberating structures. Are those things we can use? What kind of attractors and tags can we use to help people really focus on the work? How do we lower survival anxiety in our organizations so that survival anxiety doesn't get in the way of learning? These are the types of things you want to think about as, what are the things I can introduce into our system that will catalyze action that will catalyze movement toward the problem? How can I attract people to the problem that we're trying to address? How do I bring this to people? How do I frame it so that it is attractive for people, so that they engage with addressing the challenge? As we do this, though, I think it's important for each of us to look inward and understand, what we value, what's important to us. When you're in this business of facilitating adaptive leadership and trying to get people to mobilize towards addressing a problem, it's important that you understand what your own triggers are, what things matter to you, what things are non-negotiable, what your values are. Because if you don't pay attention to those things, it is also very easy to lose focus and to become distracted by all the challenges that you're dealing with. It's important to understand that uh, even as we look inward, this can cause immense challenges for us as individuals as well, because introspection is hard, it's difficult, it's one of the more difficult things to do, and we often don't like to look inward. We'd rather look outside and look at everything around us. So when you think about that, this is important to focus on. But I just want to leave everyone here with a bit of a caution about adaptive leadership, and say that it is risky business. And what makes it risky business? It's because when you reflect on the archetypes, right, whether it's espouse values not matching behaviors, or competing commitments, or the elephants in the room and things like that, you're beginning to address things that certain people in your organization are very, very comfortable with. And so, if you don't address those things in the right way, in the proper way, you're attempting to nudge the status quo. If you're not intentional about how you go and do that, it can actually bounce back negatively on you. I've seen so many situations where people have tried to engage and practice uh, adaptive leadership and foster it, even as leaders. And people have like revolted and said, no, we're not doing that. And before you knew it, the leader themselves found themselves outside looking in, because they were not able they did not appreciate the amount of discomfort that asking people to make changes to address adaptive challenges leads to. I need to point out that eh, when we're addressing adaptive challenges, it often requires a change in our paradigms. It requires a change in our beliefs. It requires a change in things that matter deeply to some people. If it didn't, it would be a technical challenge. It would just be something, hey, let's learn a new practice and let's do it. But it's not a technical challenge, because that's not what it's about. It's about deeper change that's required by the people who are a part of us. So, adaptive leadership is an approach to going after adaptive challenges. But I also, as I said when I started, I want to not leave anybody with the thought that this is a panacea, that this solves all the problems in the world. It does not. It's another way of thinking about how do we address challenges that are not technical, that don't have a clear problem definition, don't have a clear solution. How do we address those challenges together as a group, as a team, as an organization? How do we think about them? And that's what adaptive leadership is really getting at. It's really saying, look, there's a class of challenges in our organizations that the leader, whoever they are, however skilled they are, whatever knowledge they may have, cannot address on their own. Everybody needs to participate in creating a response that addresses the challenge, that is both effective and efficient and leads to human flourishing. And we want to get everybody participating in it. We recognize that getting people to participate is going to be difficult, because some of the changes required are going to challenge long held, deeply held, views, values, traditions, whatever the case may be. It might make people uncomfortable. It might cause people to have to give up things that they've held dearly in the past. But we also believe that that's the only way our leadership system, our organization remains viable. So I know there's going to be a open space here shortly. So a couple of open space seed questions I just wanted to put out there for people to reflect on. What are some of the adaptive challenges within your context, and what makes them adaptive challenges? What can you use as catalysts and attractors to encourage the adaptive work? How can you engage people in the adaptive work? How do you do this? How can you engage everyone? And then what changes to yourself do you need to make so your contributions can become more impactful? What changes do you need to make to yourself? All right. Some of you might know I have a whole chapter in my book on adaptive leadership. It's on Amazon and A-Press. It came out late last year. So if you want to learn more about adaptive leadership and leadership theory in general across a different set, please get my book, give me feedback, leave a review on Amazon. I will appreciate that. And with that, I think I'm at time or a little bit over time. My apologies, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Eb. So I was just about to walk up. So I see people applauding. So thank you very much. And we're going to continue in a moment. There were also some questions in the Q&A, but again, we can handle them later on during the open space if we want. And for that, before we're going to go to that, well, we're going to go to that. We're going to have Tobias here on stage. So not sure where you are, Tobias. There he goes. And he will introduce the open space. So please come on the left side of me, Tobias, so everyone can hear you.